You have almost certainly been told that this is a love story. A king, half mad with wanting a dark-eyed young woman at his court, throws over his faithful wife, defies the Pope in Rome, and tears his entire kingdom away from the Catholic Church, all for a wedding. That is the version in the schoolbooks, and it is, at the very most, a quarter true. Because underneath the romance of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn sits something colder and cleverer and far more modern. A ruler badly short of money, staring at the single richest institution in his whole country and working out, slowly, carefully, brilliantly, exactly how to take all of it. This is the year a King of England declared war on a church, the year 1534. And almost nothing about why he really did it is what you were taught. Let me set the table properly, because the man at the center of this is not yet the vast, roaring figure of the later paintings. In the 1530s, Henry is still tall, athletic, vain, sharp, and increasingly desperate about one thing above all others. He has no son. His wife of more than 20 years, Catherine of Aragon, has given him a daughter, Mary, and a long, quiet row of children who did not live. To Henry, a kingdom without a male heir is a kingdom sliding back toward the civil wars his own father had clawed the throne out of. He needs the marriage undone. He needs a new wife, and there is exactly one man on earth with the authority to grant that annulment, the Pope. So Henry asks, politely at first, and the Pope says no. Someone had to carry the blame for that failure, and the someone was Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the low-born clergyman who had risen to run England in Henry's name for the better part of 15 years. Wolsey had sworn he could deliver the annulment through his channels in Rome, and he could not. In 1529, his enemies closed in. He was stripped of his offices and his palaces, charged with treason, and taken ill on the long road south to face the king's judgment, an old and broken man. He is said to have murmured, near the very end, that had he only served God as faithfully as he had served his king, God would not have forsaken him in his grey years. Henry took a lesson from it, though not the one Wolsey might have hoped. He learned that the old, patient Roman way had failed him. He would need a new man and an entirely new plan. But here is the part the love story quietly leaves out. That no had almost nothing to do with God. Catherine of Aragon was no friendless, forgotten woman. She was the aunt of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, the most powerful ruler in Europe, a man whose armies had stormed into Rome itself only a few years before and left the Pope, Clement VII, all but a prisoner in his own city. So when Henry's request landed on Clement's desk, the Pope was not weighing scripture. He was weighing which king he was more afraid of. And it was not the one on the damp little island in the north. The truth is, this was never a clean contest of conscience between a husband and his church. It was two frightened men boxed in by a third. And Henry, cornered, began to turn over a genuinely dangerous thought. What if he simply did not need the Pope at all? That thought became a sentence, and the sentence changed history. In 1533, Henry's new right-hand man, a blacksmith's son from Putney named Thomas Cromwell, the sharpest political mind of the age, drafted a law with an opening line so bold it still lifts the hair on your arms. This realm of England, it announced, is an empire, not a province, not a junior partner reporting to Rome. An empire, whole and entire unto itself, answering to no foreign prince or potentate anywhere in the world. To sell it, Henry's lawyers even traced England's proud independence back through the mist to a mythical Prince of Troy, because nothing says sovereign quite like inventing yourself a founding legend. Strip away the 16th century language, and you are listening to an argument that will sound eerily familiar to anyone alive today. A nation declaring it will write its own laws, keep its own money, and take orders from no one across the water. More than a few historians have only half-joked that this was England's first Brexit. But Cromwell's cunning was never only in grand phrases. 2 years earlier, in 1531, Henry had pulled off something breathtaking in its sheer nerve. He charged the entire body of English clergy all together with an obscure old legal crime, and then graciously offered to pardon them for a price. To buy their way clear, the churchmen handed over a fine of more than £100,000 and, through gritted teeth, accepted Henry as head of their church, with a nervous little qualifier bolted on: as far as the law of Christ allows. It was a shakedown of an entire priesthood dressed up as due process. And the money had already begun to move. A year later, Henry had quietly choked off the annates, the yearly stream of church taxes that flowed out of England and into Rome. The break began, as these things so often do, not with a prayer, but with a payment stopped. The hammer fell in the November of 1534. Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, and with a single stroke of the pen, Henry became the only supreme head in earth of the Church of England. The Pope was not beaten in a war or out-argued by scholars. He was simply legislated out of England, deleted from 1,000 years of authority by one clause of parliamentary statute. And the crown Henry now wore was described very deliberately as imperial, with all the wealth, all the power, all the profits of the old church annexed and united to it. Read that word again: profits. This was a founding document, yes. It was also, in plain sight, an invoice. And here, before we go a single step further, I'll tell you where I land, because I suspect you'll have a firm view of your own. When I read those acts, I do not see a lovesick husband. I see one of the most audacious power grabs in all of European history, dressed up as a matter of the soul. If that lands for you, if you think Henry was, underneath everything, less a reformer than the most successful raider England ever produced, then hit the like button and plant your flag beside mine. But if you reckon I'm being unfair, that a real crisis over the succession and real conviction were tangled up in this too, then say so in the comments and make his case for him. I'll be reading. Which brings us, at last, to the treasure. Because there was treasure, an almost unimaginable amount of it. To grasp what Henry was truly looking at, throw out the idea of the church as a quiet, prayerful thing on the edge of town. In 1530s England, the church was the single largest landowner in the realm, holding something close to a full quarter of all the land in the country. The monasteries alone pulled in more than £130,000 a year, a river of income in an age when a working man might earn only a few pounds across the whole of it. Their walls held gold and silver, jewelled shrines, enormous estates, and stacks of hard cash. And they gave back to the poor around them, on average, only a thin 5% of what they took in. Picture the wealthiest, most powerful corporation you can name today, the kind that seems to own a slice of everything. That is roughly what the church was, sitting inside a kingdom whose king was chronically, embarrassingly broke. Henry had inherited a real fortune from his careful father. He had then spent years pouring it into wars in France and into a court built purely to dazzle. In 1520, he had met the King of France on a field near Calais for a summit so absurdly extravagant, tents woven from real gold thread, fountains running with wine, a temporary palace conjured out of nothing, that the place is remembered to this day as the Field of the Cloth of Gold. It won England precisely nothing but a fortnight of spectacle, and it drained the treasury by a small fortune. By the time he looked hungrily across at the monasteries, the man who ruled England could barely afford England. And there, In front of him stood the richest institution he had just, so conveniently, made himself the head of. And yet, for all that thrift, the monasteries were stitched into ordinary life in ways nothing else was. They were the inns that sheltered the traveller, the nearest thing to a hospital for the sick, the libraries that copied and guarded books by candlelight, the moneylenders and landlords and poorhouses of half of rural England. Pull them down, and you were not merely seizing gold. You were tearing out a piece of the country's daily machinery that had turned for the better part of 1,000 years. Henry knew that perfectly well. He wanted the gold more. What happened next is the moment this stops feeling like the Tudors and starts feeling like a corporate takeover. Before you seize a company, you audit it. You send in the accountants to learn precisely what it owns, down to the last candlestick. And that is exactly what Cromwell did. In 1535, he launched the Valor Ecclesiasticus, a colossal, kingdom-wide survey of every scrap of church wealth in England and Wales. Teams of commissioners fanned out across the land, sworn to record the income, the acres, the plate, and the rents of every last monastery, priory, and abbey. Picture the scene at 100 quiet gates, a knot of hard-eyed royal men riding up out of the morning mist, dismounting, demanding the account books, pacing the cold cloisters while a clerk scratches numbers onto a roll, and the monks watching in silence, understanding, slowly, exactly what all this careful counting was truly for. It was the largest financial survey the country had seen in 400 years, and its real purpose was written between every line. Not devotion, inventory. How much is in there, and how much of it can we take? And the taxes had already turned. Those yearly payments that once ran to the Pope, redirected now straight into Henry's own treasury, alongside a brand new tax of 10% on all church income invented late in 1534. The head of the church had begun, quite simply, to tax his own church for himself. But you cannot rob the most beloved institution in the land and expect the people to cheer. Not unless you first change the way they see it. And this is where Thomas Cromwell reveals himself as something the 16th century had never quite met before, the first great spin doctor. Cromwell grasped the one weapon Henry's ancestors never had, the printing press. He set the royal printer to work and loosed a flood of cheap pamphlets, tracts and arguments across the country, written by clever men on his payroll, pitched at every level from the scholar down to the man who could barely read. The message was relentless and single-minded. Rome is foreign. Rome is greedy. Your king is in the right, and the monks are rotten. It was, in every meaningful sense, a coordinated media campaign 4 centuries before anyone had a name for such a thing. If you want a mirror held up to our own age, there it is. Cromwell had understood, long before us, that if you control the story, you barely need to control anything else. And he did not stop at pamphlets. This is the detail that stopped me cold the first time I met it. Alongside the money men, Cromwell sent a second team of visitors into the monasteries, not to count the silver, but to gather scandal. They came back with a lurid catalogue of every failing, every idle monk, every whispered rumour and petty corruption they could dig up, or, frankly, dress up. Some of it was surely true. A great deal of it was almost certainly invented, or wildly stretched. It hardly mattered. That dossier existed for one reason alone: to hand Henry a moral excuse for a decision he had already made about the money. It is, near enough, the oldest opposition file in England. Gather the dirt, true or not, then release it at the precise moment it justifies the thing you were always going to do. And I would honestly love to know what you make of that. If you had been the man handed that assignment, find me the worst you can and don't be too fussy about whether it's real. Could you have done it? Tell me down below. I read everyone. A regime this bold breeds enemies. And Henry's answer to that problem is the darkest turn in the whole story. That same winter, the same Parliament passed another law, the Treason Act of 1534, and it did something new and genuinely frightening. It made treason a matter not only of what you did, but of what you said. Under this act, to call the king a heretic, or a tyrant, or a usurper of his crown, even in words, even out loud across an alehouse table, could cost you your life. Picture it. A carpenter, 3 ales into a cold evening in some market town, grumbling about the king's new marriage and his war on the abbeys. In an England before this law, that is merely tavern talk. In the England Cromwell was building, the man drinking at his elbow might be listening very carefully indeed, and the walls, quite suddenly, had ears. A hush of quiet informing settled over the country, neighbour grown wary of neighbour, because a single careless sentence could now be carried to a magistrate. If the phrase, "the state is watching what you say," sends a chill down your spine, understand that ordinary people were living inside exactly that feeling nearly 500 years ago. And this law was no idle threat. When the oath was pressed upon the monks of the London Charterhouse, a house of silent, austere men who wanted nothing more than to be left alone with their prayers, they would not swear that any king could stand at the head of God's church. They were among the first to pay the ultimate price for a conviction quietly held. John Fisher, the single bishop in all of England with the nerve to refuse outright, followed them. The Pope named him a cardinal in open defiance, which only sealed his fate. But the name that rang loudest across Europe belonged to a man who never once raised his voice. His name was Sir Thomas More. He had been the King's Lord Chancellor, his friend, one of the most admired minds in Europe. When the oath came round, swear that Henry is supreme head, swear the new marriage lawful, More would not take it. He did not argue. He did not preach against his king. He simply, carefully, said nothing, and rested on an old and reasonable principle of law, that silence must be read as consent. But this was a new world, with new rules, and in it even silence was no longer safe. His refusal to say the words was treated as though it had shouted them. He was tried, he was condemned, and it cost him his life. Sit with that for a moment. A man was lost not for what he said, but for what he would not say. When a state begins to punish silence, it is no longer asking for your obedience, it is demanding your belief. With his enemies quieted and his story sold, Henry at last reached for the prize. From 1536, the monasteries began to fall. First the smaller houses, then the great and ancient abbeys, hundreds of them, emptied and stripped and swept into the crown's hands. Centuries of hoarded wealth flooded into Henry's treasury in what was, by sheer land and value, the largest transfer of property England had seen since the Normans came. The great shrines were torn open for their jewels. At Canterbury, the golden tomb of Thomas Becket, for 300 years the most dazzling pilgrim destination in England, crusted with gems and gifts from kings, was stripped bare and carried off, its treasure said to have filled wagon after wagon. A saint's resting place became, almost overnight, a single line in the royal accounts. But here is Cromwell's true masterstroke, and it is pure, cold brilliance. Henry did not simply keep it all. He sold great portions of it, cheaply to the nobles and the hungry rising gentry, the very men whose loyalty he needed most. And the instant they bought that land, they were bound to him forever. Because if the old church ever returned, they would have to give every acre of it back. In one move, Henry had turned the wealthiest, most influential families in the country into people with a permanent, personal financial stake in making sure his reformation could never, ever be reversed. He did not merely take the money, he used the money to buy a loyalty that would outlast him by centuries, and the ripples never truly stopped. That vast redistribution of land helped lift a whole new class of English gentry into wealth and power, reshaped how the countryside itself was owned and farmed, and set changes running that historians still trace forward into the very making of the modern economy. As for Cromwell, the architect of all of it, he rose to the summit, and then in 1540 fell to the very same weapon he had forged, condemned for treason and lost to the king he had served so ruthlessly well. The tool always turns in the hand in the end, and Henry's strange new world is still, quietly, all around us. The Church of England he founded stands to this day, its monarch, its supreme governor even now. The broken shells of those abbeys still rise out of green English fields, roofless and beautiful, and you can walk straight into them on any grey afternoon. And here is my favourite thread in the whole tapestry. Back in 1521, before any of this began, that very Pope had rewarded Henry with a grand title, Defender of the Faith, for writing a book attacking Martin Luther. Henry went on to demolish that Pope's power in England and kept the flattering title anyway. Its initials are stamped to this day on the coins sitting in a British pocket, a medal from an enemy worn for 500 years. No, it was never really a love story. It was money and power and printing presses and fear and one of the boldest heists ever pulled off in broad daylight, with a wedding held up in front of it like a beautiful distraction. I'm Arthur, and if the real machinery underneath the myth is the thing you come here for, then subscribe and stay a while, and tell me below which piece of this you already half knew, and which one genuinely caught you off guard. That's all from me, because in the end, Henry did not conquer the church with an army. He did something newer and quieter and far more lasting. He audited it, he out-argued it, he outlawed it, and then he simply signed it away.